Thank you very much for inviting me here today. And please, do not believe everything Ricardus has said. He has got an inflated view. This year is the 50th anniversary of the first time I entered a classroom as a teacher. And during those 50 years of experience going into classrooms, I have watched many changes. I've heard many arguments. I've watched systems changing. And quite often, there was a great deal of, to quote Shakespeare, sound and fury, signifying nothing. For me, the education system is my interest. And my interest is, does the system enable us to produce a good citizen? The purpose of education is to equip the citizens with the knowledge, skills, experience, and values to be able to participate and be active in their own community. So bear that in mind, because that is what informs my commitment to education. Now, today I want to look at the system. And the first thing is to look at the context in which we operate. The second aspect that I will look at is the difference between a change and a shift, between change and reform. The third thing I will look at is the alignment or the coherence of the system. And finally, to look quickly at some enabling attributes of a system. Before I start, let me say this. My background is economics. So I was originally an economics teacher. And so you have to excuse, there's a certain distortion of my mentality has occurred because I'm studying economics. But it did contribute something useful. It helped me to understand clearly education is an investment program. We are investing in the future. And like all investment programs, we have a duty to ask, what will be the return on our investment? But we have to answer that question before we start making the investment. What is it you want as a result of your investment? Now, we are living in a context where we can't solve the problems by looking backwards. The things that got us in the hole will not get us out of the hole. We have to think differently. And this is shared by scientists, and it's shared by the military. Generals are saying things are changed. Now, if they can say these things, it might be worth our while paying attention and starting to think, well, how do we think about it? The first thing I would draw your attention to is, for small nations, having looked at a number of small nations and participated in the planning and so on, from Lithuania out to Tajikistan, all the small nations in between, I've gone into their ministries. And the lesson which I've learned is that small nations no longer can plan for a domestic context. Their operational context will result from the dynamic interaction of the external environment and their domestic environment. How is that manifest? A recent estimate tells me that there are 700,000 Lithuanians working outside of this country. There is 20 to 25% of your national budget is the result of inflows from outside of the country. Now, it tells you, for educators, that you have to look at this dynamic context when you're making decisions of how are we going to prepare our citizens. But I do not see, frankly, in many small nations, a thorough examination of this dynamic in ministries of education. Ministries of trade look at it much better. Even security ministries look at it much better. But education still seems to practice on the view that we are exclusively domestic. We are a place. Well, I think we must start to realize that small nations such as Lithuania are no longer a location. They are a network. And round that network, the economy is moving. People are moving. Ideas are moving. Resources are moving. They may pass through this place, but the network is what is causing the functioning of the dynamic. Although it is a network, we have to be careful. Solutions that worked in another country, in another place, in another time in history are not likely to work in this place and in this time in history, because we are living and operating in a dynamic context. What I have learned is that it is the changing of the mentalities that is absolutely critical. And that will only occur where the system has two attributes: effective leadership who are effective communicators of the new ideas. If the new ideas are not effectively communicated by the leadership of education, by the leadership of the country, then we all might as well just sit back and whistle, because nothing will propagate. There has to be that commitment to new ideas, and they have to be communicated. Of all the countries I've visited, they have a common characteristic in education. They all produced educational plans. And I cannot think of any of them who produced an effective communication plan, both to develop the plan or to disseminate the plan. So how are people supposed to know what's expected of them? You know, they don't learn by osmosis. So that the next thing we have to look at is the alignment of the system. What have I learned as I've moved about? I've learned that there's 4 defining processes that affect every educational system and every governance system. There is the judicial process. That is the system, not having a judge and so on, but a judicial mentality. A mentality that says the law has meaning. Secondly, there is an administrative process. Now, the administrative process links the institutional and the bureaucratic. If our institutions, our bureaucratic practice, does not have the correct knowledge, skills, experience and values to implement new ideas, then there's no point in advocating them. If you do not invest to equip the bureaucracy with the array of skills and knowledge needed to support reform, then you cannot achieve the reform. It's as simple as that. My great-granddaughter, well, my granddaughter is a better example. She is French, so her first language is French. And I heard her telling my great-granddaughter, "You must listen to Grandpa in English." And my great-granddaughter, who has no English, just stood there looking. So we had no communication. She hadn't the skills. And I think we all have to face up to this. The institution, when I use the term institution, I mean that body of regulation that governs how we are to behave as bureaucrats. A bureaucracy for me is not people. Bureaucracy is the array of knowledge, skills, and experience that you use to implement government policy. And then there's the civic process. For me, this is often overlooked. Many reforms are content to ask the community and the parents to participate, but only to participate in implementation, not in conceptualization, not having responsibility for defining what should go on in the schools. In other words, come in and be a teaching assistant, but don't dare assume to contribute to the definitional debate. But sometimes it's not possible to get the community to participate because we have not invested in equipping them with the necessary array of knowledge and skills needed to participate. And then we say to them, well, why don't you participate? Well, it's simple. We don't know how to participate. We don't know what to do and how to do it. So any reform will require some measure of civic program investment in order to have that process working. And then the fourth one is the political process. And here I'm using it in a more abstract sense, because it's not my role to comment on direct political practice. What have I found in ministries of education? that there is confusion at the leadership level. Ministers have tended to think that they are the executive manager of the education system. And people who work in central ministries, when I ask them, who's your boss? They always answer, the minister. Now, the minister is not your boss. Your manager is your boss. The minister is the political authority with full responsibility for three functions: answering to Parliament, ensuring that policy is translated into programmes, and accounting for the performance of the use of public funds. The managers of the ministry are responsible for programming, for projects, for implementation. If we continue to confuse the political process with the administrative management process, we will continue to have a very low level of efficiency in respect of implementation. The second point I'll make in respect of this diagram is this. You cannot have any of these processes functioning if you do not give the people involved responsibility, authority, and resources. Too often I am finding that people in education are given responsibility but no authority. Or they're given responsibility and no resources. My question is always the following when I go into a ministry and I work with any unit. Please show me your budget. And please show me your freedom to spend that budget as you see best. In most cases, they do not have a budget and they don't have the authority to spend it independently. But they are held responsible for the performance. Well, that's not fair. You cannot do that to people. Within this framework, it will react differently with each sector of the economy. So education will use this framework in a way quite differently from what, for example, the military or the security would use it. In addition, the issue causes the system to work differently. There are some issues that are of great importance to politicians. And so the political process becomes very active. There's some issues that are less important to politicians, but they are very important to the community. And the community aspect becomes very active. And then within the bureaucracy and the profession, there are certain issues that will really activate the trade unions. For example, every country I've ever been in, as soon as I say, I think we're going to reduce the workforce, we're going to reduce pensions, whoosh, I have trade unions beating down the door and shouting and jumping up and down, and quite rightly so. I'm very sympathetic to teachers' unions, having been a trade unionist. But I haven't always been right. I've been very emotional, but not correct. So that depending on the issue that you're introducing to this system, you will get different reactions. But I find that very little attention is paid to this, the differentiation of the response of the system to different issues. With the result, we are constantly caught up in an environment of agitation. And much of that agitation, and I'm going to move quite quickly here, comes from the fact that we have difficulty explaining to people the difference between a change that we want and a shift, a reform. When I change something, I move from A to B, but I'm still working with the same set of relationships. But when I carry out a reform, I'm moving to a new curve, a new system of relationships that require a new system of bureaucracy, new regulations, new practices, the building of new relationships. And that is typified in the second diagram by the movement from A to B. But you will notice something which is of great interest to me, but that's only because I like drawing diagrams. The little red line, the broken line. No one can tell you how to build that connection. You have to learn how to build that transition bridge. And that requires trust. It requires openness. It requires open discourse, inquiry, critique. Everybody has to learn. There's a risk in building that bridge. But you can't do it by diktat. Ukas don't work. It will only be done by the process. I'm trying to think of an old phrase that used to be used quite often. It will only be achieved by dialectic. If we do not have a fully communal dialectic conversation, we will not build that bridge. We will end up with little pieces of reform here, little pieces of reform there, and everybody. You know, we will end up, the image I have is people trying to cross the river where Ricardus is standing over there, I'm standing here, Egler is standing over there, and we've each got our pile of rocks, and we're throwing them in the river, and then we're walking out to the first one, and then we throw the second one out. Meanwhile, Ricardus is throwing a rock in the river, which is getting in the way of my rocks, and we end up confused. No, we've got to decide to build a bridge. It's much simpler. Dialogue, trust. If there is no trust in building this reform, this shift, you will fail, I guarantee you. Each of you must be able to guarantee the other the following. I will protect your freedom to tell me your truth because I'm confident that you will defend my freedom to tell you my truth. But both of us got to agree that there is no absolute truth, that it will be a shared movement of learning. And this is important because we have thought for too long that we could go outside of Lithuania and buy a bridge somewhere and bring it in here and we could all march to the promised land. It doesn't work. You have to invent your own. Here's another interesting thing. School improvement. What have I learned? Systems will get data and they will show improvement. And they will formulate policies and say, wow, look at this. We are improving. We are wonderful. Friends, those days are finished. If we are to survive in the 21st century, we are going to have to live and plan education in a world that is comparative and competitive. If you look at this diagram, has country A really improved? It has fallen further behind, even although it has shown an internal improvement. But the dynamic of improvement is not there. And there are things that you can do about this, such as pay attention to the data that's produced by OECD. It will help you to focus. But those who are responsible for policy and planning must start to think using this mode, that it's no longer exclusively domestic definition that will guide your reform. You have to think of competitive, comparative education. But also, it is not enough to think of your communication, your planning, etc., at one level. There must be alignment of the system at all 6 of these levels. It's no use just trying to send stuff down to the school or to the local level. Do your regulations enable people to work at each level? Because unless these levels are integrated in an effective manner that includes the law, it includes the bureaucratic processes, it includes the community processes, then it will not travel. Your message will not travel. Your learning will be limited. Very few places are paying attention to the alignment of all levels. And for small nations, we are not paying, in my judgment, sufficient attention to the need to equip our citizens with enhanced knowledge that is needed to operate at the regional and the global level. More and more of your citizens will be operating at the regional level. That is across Europe. How are you going to prepare them? What do they need in the way of preparation to take maximum advantage of the opportunity that the region offers them? Similarly, at the global level, how are you going to equip people and your organizations to operate at the global level? I've just recently been in Africa, and one of the great complaints and regrets that's been expressed by government is that they did not have people who had the capability and the competencies to participate effectively in international negotiations. They didn't have the technical ability in their countries. We've got to think of these things. We've got to think of education being provided to manage all of these levels. When we talk about an active citizen, we mean a citizen that has the opportunity, if they wish to exercise it, and they are capable of exercising it, of operating at all 6 of these levels. If we don't think that way, we will be depriving them of opportunities. However, like all systems, there are constraints. There are constraints of the economy. There are constraints of your ability in terms of network and communications and linkages. And there are legal constraints to every system. And what I'm presenting here is something that I've been trying to understand myself over a period of about 18 months. And the ideas that are contained in this only came to me after a visit to Central Asia. When I looked at the economy, I found that successful nations actually had more than one economy. United States had an innovative economy, they had an investment economy, and they had a resource-based economy. And that offered the nation protection. When one economy became weak, the others were able to contribute and continue to contribute. I also found an interesting fact that every economy had a subsistence economy, whether it was in Africa or United States. There was a percentage of the population living in the subsistence economy. But we didn't call it that in Europe or United States or elsewhere. We called it the welfare system. The welfare system in all states provides people with the minimum required to subsist in that environment. Those people are living in a subsistence economy, and their children tend to become trapped in it. So in every society, we have a subsistence economy. And one of the terrifying things is education has not been successful in moving children out of that. But we do know from research, any education system that moves their children out of the subsistence economy gains a great deal. And here is the surprise. Even the citizen in the highest level of economy benefits educationally from removing people from the subsistence economy. So if you're going to spend money, you get a better return if you spend it on moving people from the bottom out of that trap. How big is that trap? In Britain today, United Kingdom, something like 20% of the children that entered grade 1 this morning for their education are living below the government poverty line. 20%, 1 in 5. In the United States, $2.5 million illiterates are created per year. This is a very wide trap that people are trapped in, and it pulls down the rest of the economy. So when you're looking and you're doing economic analysis, my advice to you is be clear. Which economy are you talking about? Which economy of your country are you trying to change? Because you've got multiple choices. In this diagram, We are talking about the linkages, the networks, the communications that go from the global to the local. The fewer and the weaker your linkages and networks are, the lower your performance. That's a fact. Non-negotiable. What we have found, the elite in many countries have got very strong networks going from the national level to the regional level to the global level. But the elite has very weak linkages and networks going from the national level back to the village. And so they become very privileged because they have access to information flows, knowledge flows, etc. But in those places where efforts have been made to make the networks more dense, more efficient, all the way back to the classroom, the results have been quite dramatic. Because two things appear. Teachers have access to better models, more knowledge, and children can do independent study. And this gives them incredible freedom. It also enables the teacher to become a facilitator instead of a controller. And I think that the future, if we get our networking correct, back to the classroom, we can then be a lot more sensitive in our response to the individual child, because we can allow that child to explore a world of their own choice, and we can facilitate that exploration. It is not like when I went, the first school I taught in was the school that I attended as a child. And when I went in 20 years later, I had the same textbook, I had the same timetable, and I kept getting this feeling of déjà vu, I've been here before. We can't do that with today's children. The children of today are not the children who went to school with you. Their attitudes, their values have all changed. I mean, maybe in this country it's different, but when I endeavour to tell my grandchildren about how bad it was during the Second World War, my daughters go, "Oh my God, we're going to hear Grandpa's war stories." We now have a generation of young people in this country who have no active memory of the Soviet era. All of their values, all of their insights, all of their experiences are of an independent Lithuania. So somebody better pay attention. We are not here to cure the problems of the Soviet. They are gone. It's like my garden, where I grow my vegetables. There's certain weeds that I don't bother about. They will die. But the immediate problem here is catering for that generation who were born in an autonomous Lithuania and their values. And if we don't find a way of communicating and linking with them right throughout the school, we're going to increase the problems. And the problems are self-evident to you. The third element is the legal element. If in Armenia, and I chose Armenia just because it's not Lithuania, that when I spoke with the kids at school and asked the kids at secondary school, what really is your ambition? What would you like to be? They all said, a business person. I said, and what does that mean? They said, it means you get rich. I said, well, what does it mean? How does it work? And they said, well, when you're a business person, you get to know the people in the bureaucracy. I said, so? And they said, and they, you know, you can get deals and they can help you to get business. And I said, but what about the law? Oh, they said, Dr. Welsh, don't be stupid. The law does not work when it comes to business. Now, that was most alarming. It was terrifying to me to think that there's a generation of secondary kids who actually believed that the law had no relevance. So that set me on an experiment. After that experiment, I visited 10 countries, 10 ministries of education. And I walked in the door, blah, 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 blah. I said, you know, it would be a great help to me if you could give me a copy of the national constitution and show me the sections of the constitution that govern the provision of education in your country. 80% could not find a copy of the Constitution in the Ministry of Education. When we went to the regional offices, nobody could find a copy. But it was interesting. They all asked, why do you want why do you want the Constitution? What's that got to do with your visit? I thought, well, there we go. But even more surprising, when I went to regional offices and district offices and I asked for a copy of the educational law, nobody could find it. The vast majority of those offices were not aware of the law. And we are trying to operate within a system where we cannot have a system if we are not making people deeply aware of the rule of law. Or else we just end up in chaos. We will have an absolutely chaotic situation. We will have ministers acting illegally, which I see often. Ministers saying, do this, do that, and when I ask, could you please show me the law that authorizes this behavior? Oh, we have no time for that. We need change. No, we don't. We need legal change. We need lawful change, because lawful change will protect the citizen from arbitrary behavior and will protect the bureaucrat. So we need to bring this into our thinking. When we introduce a reform, we should be asking, what changes in the law will be required in order to make this reform work? If you try to introduce a shift without changing the law, then the bureaucrat, the conservative bureaucrat, will say, oh, I'm very sorry, but you know that Regulation 127X, Section 6, 1947, says you can't do that. You've got to bring the law into alignment with your reform. If you don't, then you cannot issue clear responsibilities and authorities to the people who are working in the system. But if we put these three together, we can see if you have restricted economy, if you have limited networks, and if you're not respecting the law, your domain of opportunity is limited. It becomes restricted. There are things that you will not be able to do. And quite often I hear ministers in countries where there are severe restrictions of this type talking about, well, we must introduce an innovative economy. Well, if you have these restrictions, my friends, you cannot achieve an innovative economy. It just won't work. So that you have to, again, see that you are planning within a framework of a dynamic, not just an educational issue. It is a wider and more extensive issue. Because each of these factors work to affect your absorptive capacity. Your capacity to absorb new ideas, your capacity to utilize those ideas. It will also restrict your ability to adapt those new ideas. Adapt them to fit your requirements, to fit your vision and purpose. Because with poor networks, the ideas won't come. With weak bureaucracies, the ideas will not enter. So if you do not see that education, in the final analysis, in the 21st century, is geared to changing the absorptive and the adaptive capacity of the nation, you cannot aspire to an innovative capability. Education strategy, I would argue, has to tell me, how am I going to change these capacities in the country? And if they can tell me that, then we will be moving in the right direction. Because we are facing the fact that I would say the 21st century, strategically, the strategic challenge of the 21st century is going to be movement. And what do I mean by that? First of all, this movement will be typified in 5 particular areas. First of all, there's the movement of information. It is going to accelerate, it's going to become more and more widespread, and people will have to deal with it. Second, and increasingly influential, is the movement of images. When I watch my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren acquire information, I'm surprised at how much it is dominated by image. I've just come recently from an Indian village out on the edge of Gujarat. And someone from the village had gone to the United States and bought them a gift of a satellite dish. And I went to the village and I found that the children were watching satellite television for 6 hours a day. And I couldn't help but wonder, now, here they are in this terribly impoverished environment. Their physical horizon is where the buffalo is that they're looking after that day. But their psychological horizon is where the satellite takes them. What's going on there with these images coming in from everywhere? I don't know, but I think it's one of the big movements. The third movement is people. Small nations are going to have to live with the fact that their citizens are going to be increasingly mobile. More and more of them are going to move. And one of the big challenges here for educators is, how do you establish the national culture where you have high regional and global mobility? And it will be practically important, because if those mobile citizens break their connection with your country, then the economic network is also broken, and that has consequences for you. And so people will move. In my village, we have a small church. On Sunday, we have 3 masses. We have a mass in English, we have a mass in Polish, and we have a mass in Lithuanian. And this is a small English village. More Lithuanians go to my church than English people. The social evening organized in our church hall on a Saturday night is organized by Polish people. That's the world we're living in. So far, most of them pay a visit back home, or they send money back home. But their children are all speaking English. And when I ask them, what's it like when you go back to Lithuania? They go, well, you know, I know what they're saying to me, but I don't know how to answer them. And the third element are other resources. These resources, the movement of resources is going to get greater and greater. And they are going to be both natural and artifact resources. And if you're not involved in the movement of those resources, you will be impoverished. If your people are not skilled in participating in that process of creating and moving resources, you will suffer economically. The 5th element I draw your attention to that will impact your system is one that I cannot claim to understand at all, but I am aware of it. It is the movement of values. There are tremendous movements of values, and the impact on the society is significant. And I can only look at my own family. I was born in Scotland. My children live in France, Switzerland, and England. My grandchildren speak English as a first language. One of them speaks French, and the other one speaks something from Switzerland that my French grandchildren say is not real French. It's Swiss French. It's not good French. And then I have another granddaughter who speaks Arabic. Now, here we are, when we all sit round the table, and multiple values at work, and understanding of language and what it means. Just at Easter Sunday, I had an interesting experience as they were sitting talking, and I noticed that they kept shifting language round the table. It was just clickety-click. Sometimes, if it was a particular book and it was in French, they spoke in French to each other. If it was in English, they spoke in English, and just moved about. I would like to say I achieved that as a responsible parent, but that wouldn't be true. It was an accident. But I'm glad it happened. But it doesn't have to be an accident. Values are going to change, and we're going to have to live with diversity. How do we train children to tolerance? We hear about the problems of children being violent, children committing self-harm, and so on. What are we teaching them in the way of self-valuing and valuing each other? Any educational strategy that will be developed for the 21st century must have at its heart the question of values. It cannot be avoided. How do we deal with diversity? How are we going to achieve peaceful diversity? And those 5 great movements are going to impact you whether you like it or not. The tsunami of change is coming your way. And I would advise you, get to the high ground or build a big boat. But you must enable the system to go. And that means that there must be greater delegation down through the system of responsibility. There must be greater communication and more effective communication. And there must be a respect for the law. If that doesn't happen, your reforms will not float when the tsunami arrives. Thank you very much.